Hi everyone, my name is Sarah, and I want to tell you a story about how I spent last summer vacation and celebrated my birthday. I will definitely never forget such a holiday. For my birthday, my friends gave me a small trip under the water. I wasn't very good at swimming, but I was very curious to see what was under the water. Actually, to tell the truth, it was my first birthday that I was going to celebrate, which is why the girls decided that this day should be special. The fact is that for as long as I can remember, my mother and I have never celebrated. Nothing. No holiday, no New Year, no Christmas, nothing at all. It was all about saving money. The fact is that my father was very ill. He was bedridden after a stroke and couldn't walk, and couldn't actually move. He was like a vegetable. Accordingly, he needed constant medical supervision, massages, medications, and all that cost a lot of money. We saved almost all our lives. My mother took care of my father for 15 years, so when I was born, he was already like this. I can't imagine how my mother raised me and took care of a sick husband. Dad understood and saw everything, even though he couldn't show it. He saw how hard it was for his wife, and he began to hate himself. In general, he committed suicide. Somehow he managed to cut off his oxygen supply. My mother was very ill, and so was I, but she held on. 2 years had passed since my father's death, and my mother said that it was time for me to experience what childhood was like, because I never had one. I was happy and told my friends about it, so they decided to make an unforgettable gift. We chose a sunny day and went to the sea. Although I was very worried, I was still looking forward to this event with impatience. I liked all sorts of unusual types of recreation. My friends and I took a day off from our parents, took swimsuits, a special camera to take pictures underwater, some food, and went to the sea. The mood was great. I was looking forward to a great holiday and cool photos. Upon arrival, we immediately booked a comfortable place on the beach. Although, to be honest, there were not very many people. The girls and I did not take instructors. We wanted to slowly enjoy the moment and explore everything around us. We just took oxygen tanks, a wetsuit, glasses, and went down into the water. As soon as we sank in, I immediately felt the water lifting my internal organs up. The water below was cooler the closer to the shore, and it was also very dark, and we needed special flashlights. I was swimming with the girls, holding hands, but then we realized that it was inconvenient. Carol decided to swim ahead and motioned for us to follow. Agnes and Tori followed her, and I decided to stop for a few seconds to take a picture with a cool fish in the background. When I looked up, I noticed that the girls were gone. It was empty and dark, and I started to panic a little. I decided that there was nothing wrong because I just needed to swim out to the top, and that's it. After taking a couple of breaths from the tank, I looked up and pushed off from the bottom. At this moment, I was somehow led sideways. I realized that the tide was coming in or out, and I was sharply spun in the abyss and lost my orientation. I didn't know where the top and where the bottom was. After I leveled off, I decided to swim forward, hoping that the girls were somewhere nearby. I saw a corridor of rocks, swam through it, and found myself in a small room of rocks. There was little space to breathe. I took off my costume and started yelling for the girls. But no one heard me. I looked at the tank and realized with horror that I had no oxygen. And then I had a real panic. I began to scream, tried to sink down to the bottom to see if any of the dangerous fish were swimming or if my girls were visible, but nothing worked. And my panic was quickly draining the air out of my lungs. I went up and down, tried to swim back through this corridor, but it was too long. I'd get stuck halfway and come back. At some point, it seemed to me that everything was over. This is how I will die on my 15th birthday. I don't know how much time passed, probably more than 6 hours, because I started to get cold, and I was up to my chest in water. The fact that I didn't move much, didn't eat or drink anything, made my legs feel numb. I began to massage my feet in the water, then tried not to stand still, but to try to swim. But I quickly got tired, because I was already too weak. And then I got really angry and realized I didn't want to die like this. I put my tank on again, and the remaining oxygen should have been enough for me to at least get out of the corridor. I put on my phone and my glasses and swam forward with all my strength. I swam as fast as I could. All of a sudden, I felt like I was having a hard time breathing. I was out of oxygen. I took one last breath and threw the tank out the way. As I swam forward, I saw the end of the corridor. Yes! I managed to swim through it, but I didn't have the strength to go up. I was desperately catching air in the water like a fish on land, and I knew I couldn't swim out. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my lungs, stomach, nose, and ears. I suddenly felt sick and started spitting water. I opened my eyes and realized that I was lying on dry land. Someone was looking down at me, and my friends and my mother were standing next to me, crying loudly. "She's alive! Alive!" someone yelled nearby. I realized that I was pulled out and pumped out. I was so sick I couldn't speak. An ambulance arrived a few minutes later and took me to the hospital. After 2 or 3 days, I finally ate on my own and accumulated the strength to talk. It turns out that the girl swam forward, and I was carried away by a wave and lost. And then, when I swam out of the cave, divers found my tank at the bottom and realized that I was somewhere nearby. As they swam on, they saw me, and I was no longer breathing. So miraculously, I was found and pumped out. That birthday was almost my last. In short, since then, I no longer dive without the help of a pro, and I do not advise you guys to do it either. How do you celebrate your birthdays? What birthday do you remember the most? Tell us in the comments.
I'm Charlotte. Just a month ago, I managed to get out of my boyfriend's trap. Ex-boyfriend, actually. I'm still reeling from the horror I've been through. And the first thing I found out is that my boyfriend is actually a maniac. I'll tell you about it because I can't keep silent any longer. In the meantime, subscribe and watch other animations. After all, we still have a lot of interesting stories. Anyway, it was winter when we met Benjamin. We ran into him at the ice rink. Everything seemed so romantic. Benj kept me warm with his jacket that night, buying hot coffee while we went for a ride. And in the late afternoon, we went to a dinner and ate burgers, and after that, he didn't walk me home. It was wonderful. I laughed a lot with him, and Benjamin could make jokes. Then he showed up the next day, invited me for a walk, and the next day we went to a movie, to a cafe. Each time he came up with a new occupation. We saw each other every day, and when it didn't work out, he wrote or called. Imperceptibly, feelings grew. I introduced him to my friends, mother, and sister. Even though it hadn't been long since we'd started dating, I felt like I loved him. He made a positive impression on everyone, and I was proud of it. Benj himself was a little older than me. He was the only man in the family, so he earned as much as he could to support the family, his mother and brother. I was struck by his strength of spirit, the optimism that he exuded. Several times he left for work in another city, but never forgot to bring back some souvenir. However, he never told me exactly what he did, and I didn't know where he lived. These things didn't bother me at all, because the main thing was his attitude and love. About 3 months later, Benjamin invited me to spend the weekend with him. He rented a small cottage in the mountains. It was already spring, and the view from there promised to be amazing. I told my mother I was going to Tiffany's to study for my school exam, and I went with him. My girlfriend promised to cover for me. That's why I loved her the most. She told me not to worry about anything and to rest. What could sound better? I quickly packed my bag and ran out of the house. My boyfriend was already waiting for me on the street. We jumped in the car and drove off. Despite the fact that it was raining and it was cool, the mood was good. Spring, after all. A couple of hours later, we arrived at this cottage. It was beautiful, small, incredibly cozy. There were only 4 rooms, and the living room with the fireplace was the largest. It was warm inside, and there were groceries in the kitchen. It turns out that Benjamin had already made supplies for us. I offered to make pasta, but he said that he would do everything himself. Poured me wine, sat me in a chair, covered me with a blanket, and went to cook, while I watched my favorite TV series on my laptop and waited for dinner. From the kitchen floated a delicious smell of something meat. After a couple of hours, Benj called for food, and he cooked chicken in the oven and a salad. After a big dinner, we went out on the porch, but he stood behind me and hugged me, talking about his feelings. I don't think I've ever been happier. It was beautiful. Suddenly his phone rang, and he went into the house. And I wanted to enjoy the cool air, and I stayed. A second later, I heard the sound of a voice. Or I thought I heard it. I started to listen, but it was hard to do because of the rain. The strange thing was that there was nothing else nearby except our house. Voices from the basement? Then someone touched my shoulder sharply from behind, and I screamed and shuddered. It was Benj. "What are you doing? Is everything okay? Can you have enough wine already?" he said, laughing. Then he apologized and said he needed to leave for a couple of hours. His friend had a flat tire in his car, and he was stuck not far from here, and he needed help. I nodded my head and said that everything was fine. I would wait for him here. Benji started the car and drove away. I went inside and poured myself more wine. The empty house didn't look so nice to me now. As soon as I sat back in my chair, the same voices rang out in my head. I tried to distract myself by turning up the volume on the show, but I kept thinking about that voice. Am I being paranoid? Turning off the computer, I lay down on the floor and tapped my fist several times. And I was answered. Oh my God! I knocked again and heard, "Save!" I was terrified. I got up abruptly from the floor and didn't know what to do. Then I heard the blows and pleas for help even more clearly. I was so scared that I wanted to run. I ran out into the street, reached the gate, and stopped. Something made me come back. I knew the sounds were coming from underground. I ran into the backyard and found a door leading to the basement, which was covered with boards. I could barely dig it out, and there was an iron lock on the door. I managed to break it with a crowbar. Then I saw steps leading down. It was damp, dark, and smelly. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and started walking slowly down the stairs. Inside, there were some unnecessary things and nothing else. Then I heard again, "Save!" It turns out there was another room. I opened the door and saw that inside the dim light is sitting some girl. Looking at me, she began to ask for help in a loud voice. My legs gave way from fear and my heart seemed to run into my heels. Somehow intuitively, I ran to her and untied her hands. The girl was unhurt, but very exhausted. She looked at me in the face and told me I had to run away. We held hands, but the door closed abruptly. She screamed, and I realized that Benjamin was back. I asked him to open the door, promising that everything would be kept secret, no one would find out what happened here. I swore. And he just said, "You're right. No one will know what happened here." And the footsteps began to move away. Emily, that's her name, got hysterical and started crying and said that he was going to come with a camera and start hitting us and taking pictures. This was his fetish, and it was the least of the evils that he did with other girls. "He's a real maniac!" screamed Emily. But I wasn't ready to give up, and I wasn't ready to panic. He left out one detail, my phone number. I immediately called the police and gave them my approximate location. Help should be here any minute. Suddenly, we heard the door begin to open slowly. I pressed myself as close to the wall as I could. Benj came down the steps, and I hit him in the back of the head with my phone. He fell, but got up quickly and hit me in the face. Then he started saying that no one would be able to get out of his trap and attacked me again. Amelia jumped on his back, but he deftly turned her over on the ground. I could already hear the dogs barking in the street. The police had arrived. We screamed as hard as we could. Employees quickly broke down the door to the basement. Benjamin did not even have time to think as he was handcuffed. Emily was very scared, and I was also in shock. It turns out that his name was not Benji, and he has recently been wanted in a neighboring town. His weakness is schoolgirls. In general, he is a pedophile with abnormal sadistic tendencies. Now he faces jail. Well, I don't go to the rink anymore.